They all came to our engagement dinner, except my parents. When I called, my mother said, "We were busy celebrating your brother's funding round." I just smiled and said, "Then don't be surprised when you miss the wedding too." A week later, my father showed up with a letter he wasn't meant to find. I said, "Read it out loud." I knew my family wasn't coming long before I admitted it out loud. My name is Ria. I'm 31 years old, I live in Chicago, and I work as a museum conservator. I've always been the one who does everything by the book: graduate school, respectable career, a condo I bought myself near Lincoln Park. I never asked for much, just to be seen, heard, maybe even chosen. Instead, I grew up in a house where validation was something you had to wrestle for. My brother Darren never had to. He opened his mouth and the spotlight followed. Coding at age 10, Stanford by 18, VC darling before he could legally drink. My parents, especially my mother, practically glowed in his presence. It was like watching someone orbit their own little sun, and I was just there. I remember once at a family dinner I mentioned a traveling exhibition I was coordinating, something about ancient pigments and preservation. My mom nodded vaguely, then launched into how Darren's startup had doubled its valuation overnight. He had solved something real, she said, something that mattered. So yeah, that was the house I grew up in. But things are different now. At least they're supposed to be. Because now I have Lena. And Lena sees me, not for what I produce or how many lines my resume has, but for me, the version who listens too long to audiobooks, who eats cereal at night, who once cried over a broken ceramic fragment because it had been so loved. Lena, who spends weeks in the rainforest tagging ocelots and once held my hand through a panic attack in a grocery store because the fluorescent lights were too much. She made me feel like being chosen wasn't a competition, it was just a choice, one she made again and again. So when she proposed under the massive sycamore tree in Humboldt Park, where we'd first kissed after a second date gone too late, I said yes. Of course I said yes. We decided on an engagement dinner first. Something small but warm. 40 people max, friends who felt like family. Chosen family. There'd be twinkle lights in the courtyard of our favorite neighborhood bistro. Good wine. Soft jazz. Nothing flashy. Just real. We sent the invites months in advance. Lena's parents responded the next day. Her brother even offered to make a toast. My colleagues from the museum were excited. My cousin Jenna cried on the phone when I told her. And my actual family? My mother said she'd check the calendar. My dad forwarded the invite to Darren with a one-line email. Not sure if you saw this. That was it. 3 months out. 2, 1, nothing. No RSVP. No call. Not even a passive-aggressive "wish we could be there" text. I left a voicemail the week before. My mom never called back. We still saved them a table. Front row near the window, where the light would hit just right. I told myself maybe they'd surprise me. Maybe they'd walk in last minute, slightly overdressed, pretending everything was fine. But even as I folded the linen napkins that morning, I already knew the answer. They weren't coming, because they never really had. The night of the dinner was beautiful. And brutal. Lena looked incredible in a navy wrap dress, her curls tucked behind one ear. Her mom brought a peach pie she had baked that morning. Our friends showed up with flowers and old stories, laughter bubbling up like champagne. The weather held steady at 72 degrees, with the breeze coming in just light enough to make the paper lantern sway gently above us. But that table, the one we saved for them, sat there like a wound. We'd chosen it carefully. It was right by the garden wall under the string lights with a view of the head table. I had written their names on the place cards in my neatest script. I even set out a small vase of flowers in my mother's favorite colors, pink tulips and baby's breath. A stupid, hopeful gesture. They never showed. Not even a text. I kept stealing glances at the table throughout the night, watching the untouched wine glasses glint, watching the napkins remain folded, the chairs too perfectly aligned. Everyone else was laughing and hugging and telling Lena how lucky she was, how lucky we both were, how right we were together. And they were right. We were right. But that table made my throat burn. When it was time for the toast, Jenna stood and cleared her throat. "I've known Ria since we were 7, she began. We used to spend summers digging up her mom's flower beds, convinced we'd find dinosaur bones. That got a laugh. She went on about how stubborn I was, how serious, how loyal to a fault. And then Lena showed up, she said, smiling at Lena. And it was like someone had finally switched on a light she'd been reaching for her whole life. Everyone clapped. Lena squeezed my hand. I stood, heart thudding, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on me. I lifted my glass. "I've spent a long time thinking love was something you earned," I said. "Something that came after enough achievements, after you proved yourself useful enough, smart enough, easy enough to be around." But I was wrong. I looked at Lena. Love doesn't have prerequisites. It just shows up, quietly, fiercely, and without keeping score. People smiled. Someone said, "Amen," under their breath. Lena blinked fast, fighting tears. But as I lowered my glass, my gaze drifted, without meaning to, back to that table. Still empty. The name cards unread. The wine untouched. It hit like a punch. Later that night, as we loaded up leftover cake and goodbye hugs, Lena wrapped her arms around me. She didn't say anything. She just held me while I stared at the darkened street beyond the courtyard, that table still flickering behind my eyes. The next morning, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring like nothing had happened. "Oh, hi, sweetie," she said too brightly. "Sorry we missed the party. Darren had a last-minute thing." "What thing?" I asked, already knowing. "A surprise launch event," she said. "Big announcement for Series C funding or whatever it is. You know how these startups are." I closed my eyes. "I see," I said. She laughed lightly. "Don't be like that. You know how proud we are of both of you." "Then don't be surprised," I said, my voice steady, "when you're not at the wedding." There was a pause, a small inhale on her end. But I didn't stay on the line long enough to hear the exhale. 3 days after the engagement dinner, I opened my front door to find my father standing there, holding a printout in his hand like it weighed 100 pounds. He didn't call ahead. He never did. That was his style: show up, keep things casual, pretend nothing was ever that serious. But he wasn't casual now. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. "Hi, Rhea," he said. "Can we talk?" I looked at the paper in his hand. I recognized it immediately. A letter I wrote years ago, one I never meant for anyone to read. I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't sit, didn't make small talk. He stood near the edge of the kitchen table and held the paper up. "I found this in an old folder on Mom's computer," he said. "Wasn't looking for it. It just came up." I said nothing. My chest already felt tight. He cleared his throat. "Did you write this?" I nodded. He stared at the page. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Would you mind?" I said, surprising even myself, reading it out loud. He blinked at me. "Out loud?" I nodded again. "Yeah." He hesitated for a beat, then began. His voice wavered on the first line. "I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe I just want to say it out loud once, even if no one hears it. Maybe I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt." He swallowed and kept going. "I always felt like I was standing just outside the frame, watching the three of you, Mom, Darren, live a life I couldn't quite reach. It wasn't that I needed constant praise. I just wanted to be seen. Really seen. Not as the quiet one or the responsible one, but as someone who mattered to you." His voice cracked there. He stopped and looked at me. I didn't flinch. "Keep going." He looked back at the page. "I stopped trying after college. I figured if getting into a top program didn't do it, if getting my dream job didn't do it, maybe nothing would. You came to Darren's launch party with custom shirts and balloons. You barely asked me about the artifacts I helped restore at the Field Museum. It's not the attention I wanted. It's the acknowledgement, the space to be proud of something without having to explain why it mattered." By the time he reached the last paragraph, his voice had grown small. "I'm not angry. I'm tired. Tired of showing up and being invisible. Tired of telling myself, next time, they'll care. I don't need perfection. I just need presence." He finished, folded the paper in half with shaking hands, and looked at me. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said quietly. I looked at him steady. "That's the point. You never asked." He nodded slowly, eyes wet. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you were less. You didn't have to mean it," I said. "It still happened." He sat down then slowly, like the words had knocked something loose in his body. He kept his hand on the folded letter, like it was holding him together. "Your mother didn't mean to choose Darren over you," he offered weakly. "Maybe not," I said. "But she did. Every time." He looked at me for a long time. "Are we still invited to the wedding?" I stared at him. He was waiting for the soft version of me. The one who smiled through disappointment. The one who always forgave before anyone bothered to say sorry. "We'll see," I said. And I meant it. He left a few minutes later, the letter still folded in his hand. I watched him walk down the steps without saying goodbye. That letter was never meant to be read. But now that it had been, I wasn't going to make it easier for anyone. Not anymore. A few days passed. No apology. No follow-up. Nothing from my mom. Nothing from Darren. Not even a half-hearted "hope the party went well" text. Instead, one night while Lena and I were curled up on the couch, she handed me her phone, eyes narrowed. "Did you see this?" It was Darren's Instagram, a carousel of glossy, heavily filtered photos from the night of our engagement dinner, but not of our party, of his. Some kind of flashy rooftop event, all glass walls and champagne flutes and rented smiles. The caption read, "Couldn't have asked for a better night. Launch party dreams turned real. Thank you to the real ones who showed up. #Series C, #FounderLife, #grateful." There they were, my mom and dad, front and center in the second photo. Mom in her favorite silk scarf. Dad with a rare full smile, one arm slung around Darren's shoulders. They were standing in front of a branded backdrop with Darren's company name plastered across it in gold. I stared at the screen like it was a photograph of a stranger's life. The likes were in the hundreds. The comments were full of heart emojis and people saying how Darren was a visionary. How his parents must be so proud. They looked so happy, so relaxed, So proud, so complete, like nothing was missing, like I hadn't even existed that night. I handed the phone back without a word. Lena didn't press. She just reached for my hand and held it quietly, her thumb tracing soft circles against my skin. We sat there for a long time, the room silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of pipes behind the wall. Finally, I stood up and walked into the study, opened my laptop, took a breath. I pulled up the wedding spreadsheet. It was color-coded, organized, painfully thorough, a labor of love. Every guest we'd ever wanted to invite was listed with columns for RSVP status, dietary notes, gift tracking. It had taken weeks to build. My parents had their own row right near the top. Darren had one too. I stared at their names for a long time. Then I hit delete. Once, twice, 3 blank lines. Gone. I saved the file. It felt quiet, not like revenge, not like anger, just clarity. Like shutting a door that had been creaking open for too long. When I walked back into the living room, Lena didn't ask what I had done. She just looked at me and offered a soft, knowing smile. Her fingers reached for mine again, and we sat there in the silence that followed. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't peace. Not yet. It was grief, but grief with a spine. I had drawn a line, not out of spite but protection, and that would have to be enough. The letter arrived 2 days later. It was in a cream envelope with gold trim, my name written in cursive so neat it had to be traced. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. My mother had always taken pride in her penmanship, said it was a dying art. Inside was a folded sheet of heavy stationery, formal, like the kind you'd use to thank someone for a baby shower gift, or express sympathy after a distant aunt's passing. I unfolded it slowly, already bracing for what I knew wouldn't be there. It began, "Dear Ria, we received word indirectly that you were upset after the engagement dinner. While we regret not attending, I hope in time you'll understand that life rarely unfolds on a perfect schedule. Your brother's announcement was unplanned and of course we had to be there to support him. No mention of RSVPs never sent. No mention of the months of silence before that night." She continued, "We've always tried to do our best as parents. It wasn't always easy balancing 2 very different children. Darren, as you know, has always been more intense, more demanding of our energy and attention. Whereas you were so independent, even as a child. You never needed much from us and we took comfort in that." I stopped reading there. I knew the rest. I'd read that letter 100 times in other forms. Different fonts. Same message. It would go on to say how they loved me equally. How things had just been different. How they hoped I could move forward with compassion and maturity. There would be no apology. No acknowledgement. No space made for my pain. Just their version of the past, rewritten neatly, tucked into formal paper and mailed off like closure. I folded it slowly and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even finish reading it. Instead, I walked into my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand, and pulled out a copy of the letter I'd written, the unsent one my father had read aloud. I held it for a moment, running my fingers over the corner where it had worn thin from being folded and unfolded over the years. There was one line near the end that echoed louder now than ever. "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for presence." They had never offered it. And now I finally stopped needing it. I slipped my mother's letter into the trash, no ceremony, no drama. Just one quiet choice among many. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. They had written me out of their version of the story. All I did was stop chasing the pen. I wrote the message late at night, when everything was quiet and the city felt hushed under its own weight. The windows were open just a crack, and I could hear the distant rattle of the L train moving through the dark. Lena was already asleep in her room. I could hear her soft breathing, steady and warm. It grounded me, just enough to keep my hands from shaking. I opened my email, drafted it like I'd draft anything else, methodically, precisely, no flourishes, just truth. The subject line was short. Moving on. The message. "Mom, Dad, I want you to know I've thought about this carefully, not in anger, but in clarity. I've spent years trying to earn something I now understand you were never capable of giving. Unconditional love. I've chased your approval, minimized my hurt, smiled through being overlooked. I excused it as your way, our family's way. But I'm not doing that anymore. You made a choice the night of my engagement dinner. One choice among many. It wasn't just about Darren. It was about where I rank in your world and where I don't. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. I'm building a life where I am seen, chosen, and loved without having to bleed for it. Going forward, I will not be including you in the wedding or any future milestones. I'm not expecting a reply. I'm not waiting for a changed heart. This is not bitterness. This is peace. Ria." I read it twice, not to double check for typos. I didn't care if it was perfect. I just needed to feel the truth of it one more time before I let it go. Then I hit send. The screen blinked for a second, then it was gone. I sat there for a long time staring at nothing, The silence that followed didn't hurt like I thought it might. It wasn't a stab or a tear or even a throb. It was just still. Like standing on a shoreline after a storm, everything wet and quiet but intact. I turned off my laptop, walked into the bedroom. Lena stirred when I climbed in next to her, half awake, reaching for me. "You okay?" She mumbled. "Yeah," I whispered. I sent the message. She blinked once, then pulled me into her chest, resting her chin gently against my forehead. "Good," she said. And that was it. For the first time in my adult life, I fell asleep without that ache in my ribs. That heavy, invisible pull of trying to be enough for people who had already decided I wasn't. I woke up the next morning with no reply in my inbox. And for once, the silence was the answer I needed. The morning of our wedding, I woke up to sunlight. Not metaphorical light. Actual, golden, late spring light pouring through the tall windows of the Botanical Gardens guest house. Lena was still asleep beside me, her hand resting on my hip like it always did when she was completely relaxed. I watched her breathe for a while. Just be. No phone buzzing. No inbox full of demands. No sharp-edged hope lodged in my throat. Just us. Finally, just us. By early afternoon, the garden was alive. The venue was a glass-roofed atrium wrapped in ivy and tall trees. A place where light moved like water and everything felt open. We chose it because it didn't need decoration. The place had its own soul. Jenna met me by the dressing area, wearing a plum-colored jumpsuit and carrying a clipboard like it was a sword. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. "You look like someone who just forgave the world," she added with a grin. "More like someone who stopped waiting for it to change." She leaned in, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "I'm proud of you." The ceremony was simple, beautiful. Lena's parents walked her down the aisle, their arms wrapped around hers like they'd always been her anchors, and somehow mine too. I walked alone, but I didn't feel alone. Friends from every part of our lives lined the rows. Museum co-workers, Lena's field team, our neighbors, our favorite barista, chosen family, every single one of them. And in the front row, Jenna stood as our officiant, holding a tiny binder and blinking back tears before she even said a word. "Love," she began, "isn't always handed down. Sometimes we have to go out and find it, build it ourselves. And that's what Rhea and Lena have done." There was a line she read, from a poem, maybe, I don't remember the exact wording. Something about chosen family being the place where you rest, not because you've earned it, but because you belong. I felt it ripple through the crowd, but I didn't flinch. I just reached for Lena's hand, and she held it tighter. When we kissed, the light from the glass ceiling pooled around us like it had been waiting to land. Everything felt full, not loud, not perfect, just full. There were no missing pieces, no empty seats, no explanations to give. Afterward, we danced barefoot on the stone floor, surrounded by string lights and the smell of lilac from the garden. Lena's dad gave a toast about ocelots and orchids and how the real work of love was showing up, again and again, with a soft place to land. When the cake was cut, when the music slowed, and when we were alone for just a moment, I looked around at everyone gathered and realized something. This life was mine. And it was enough. Not because I made it flawless, but because I made it free. 3 days after the wedding, I got a message from Darren. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a single sentence, clipped and bitter. He didn't even tell us the date. I stared at it for a full minute, my thumb hovering over the screen. Not a question. Not an apology, just the same thing I'd always heard, just dressed in different clothes, confusion masked as accusation. Like he couldn't fathom that I hadn't built my happiness around the possibility of his attendance. I walked out onto the balcony where Lena was drinking coffee in one of my old sweatshirts, her legs curled under her. I held out my phone. She read the message, then looked at me. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. She just reached for my hand and gave it one firm squeeze, the kind that said, "You don't have to explain this to me." We didn't talk about it again. That afternoon, we left for Portugal. 2 weeks of coastline and quiet. The kind of slow joy that lingers in your body like heat after a swim. We stayed in a tiny whitewashed villa on a cliff, ate seafood with our fingers, drank cheap wine on a towel under the stars. I read novels by the water. Lena made me laugh so hard I cried over a game of cards in a windy beach cafe. Somewhere between the second swim in a hidden cove and a nap in the shade of a fig tree, the last thread of that message from Darren slipped from my mind. It didn't matter. He wasn't angry that he wasn't included. He was angry that I no longer needed to include him. On the third night, as we watched the moon rise over the Atlantic, Lena turned to me and asked gently, "Do you think you'll ever go back?" I knew what she meant. Not to Chicago, to them. I stared at the horizon, the soft curve of the earth reminding me how big the world was, and how small my life used to feel, trapped in that house, that system of conditional love and polite dismissal. "No," I said. "Not out of anger. Out of freedom." She nodded, leaning her head against my shoulder. That was the last time we spoke about my family for the rest of the trip. There were no more messages from Darren. No follow-up. No apology. Just that one last ripple, like a stone dropped into water that didn't realize how still things had become. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was peace. Coming home felt different. Not dramatic. Just steady. Like slipping into a version of myself I'd quietly been building for years, and finally settling into it without asking permission. Our apartment looked the same, but I didn't. We unpacked slowly, left the suitcases half open for a week, watered the plants we'd overwatered before we left. I went back to work at the museum, spending my days in the quiet of restoration labs and the steady rhythm of brushes and pigment. Lena prepped for her next field study in Costa Rica, sending off permits and ordering trail cameras. The world didn't collapse, not because they were gone, but because I had stopped waiting for them to hold it up. Holidays came as they do. The first was Thanksgiving. No email, no invitation, just silence. Lena's parents invited us, and it was messy and warm and full of too many side dishes. Her mom tried to make vegan stuffing and failed, and no one cared. Her dad accidentally called me his daughter. I cried later in the car, and Lena just held my hand without asking why. Christmas followed. Still no word from my family, and I didn't miss them. Not really. Not like before. We spent it at Jenna's place with her wife and their new baby. I wore a Santa hat for the first time in years and read The Night Before Christmas in a ridiculous voice that made the baby laugh so hard she snorted. Sometime in January, Jenna sent me a text. No preamble, just a photo from the wedding, me and Lena under the glass ceiling, mid-laugh, forehead to forehead. There was a note attached. Mom saw this. She cried. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I turned off my phone. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even sadness. It was just a moment, one quiet drop in a sea of silence. I didn't reach out, didn't ask what kind of tears they were, regret or resentment. I didn't need to, because I wasn't standing still anymore. I wasn't frozen, waiting for them to change. I had built a life in motion, and it moved without them. When people asked coworkers, neighbors, even friends who only knew part of the story, do you think you'll ever make up with your family? I had my answer ready. I've made peace with the past, I'd say. I don't owe it my future. And I meant it. Not bitterly, not defensively, just fully. My life didn't need fixing anymore. It needed living, and I was already doing it.